Today, Mr. Lee and we will be sharing with you 4 case studies on the treatment of speech sound disorders. Okay, there will be nothing to do with reading comprehension. Okay, something new, hopefully for you all. Okay, so Bauman 2012 defines a speech sound disorder as a person's oral communication differs from normal communication, and it interferes with communication. So speech sound disorder, in short, is also known as SSD. So later when I use the word SSD, I mean speech sound disorder. Okay. Okay, so why is there a need for us to look into and also remediate SSDs? So a child with SSD is at risk of being teased and bullied by his schoolmates as well as friends because it may be difficult to understand what he says. Okay. It can also manifest into behavioral issues because the child feels frustrated of not being understood easily. And it is certainly a risk factor for literacy difficulties. So therefore, it is very important to consult a speech and language therapist to treat speech sound disorders. Okay, the objective of our study today is to identify the critical success factor, the additional critical success factors, in addition to the therapy approaches and strategies, as well as the therapist-dependent factors that will lead to maximum positive therapy outcomes in the treatment of SSD at DAS. I realize I skipped one slide. It's okay, I finished this, I will go back. Okay, I'm so sorry. Yes, okay, so I talk about the SSD treatment. Okay, so Strebert et al., 1994, mentioned that the therapy goal for treatment of SSD is to eliminate speech sound errors. So at DAS, the treatment for SSD follows the evidence-based practice. So this includes contrast therapy, called vocabulary approach, cycles approach, as well as metaphor therapy, just to name a few. And all this evidence-based practice will be explained in the case studies that we're going to share with you later. Okay, so sorry, I skipped this slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the prevalence of speech sound disorders. So a couple of studies are done in 1986, 1999, and also 2015. So the prevalence of SSD in preschoolers was 3 to 6%. There's another study done in 2015 by Black et al. The prevalence rate for 3 to 17-year-old population was approximately 5%. And at DAS, 15% of our caseloads were to treat speech sound disorder in preschoolers as well as school-age children. Okay, so this shows the traditional hierarchy for the treatment of speech sound disorder. So we will start with remediating the breakdown at phoneme level, which is known as, isolation. Okay, when the child is able to make the sound by itself, for example, then we will pair the individual sound with a vowel to form a syllable. So next, we will put the target sounds into real words phrases, and sentences. Okay, so we will use words that have the target sound in the beginning, middle, and end. So then, the child will practice producing the target sound in structured speech through a reading activity or a storytelling activity. So finally, the child is ready to produce the target sound in everyday speech, which is in conversation. Okay, so for the purpose of our inquiry, we have looked, okay, at 2 pairs of students who presented with similar speech sound disorders. So this means that when I present case study 1 and 2, the 2 students presented with similar speech sound disorders. Then when Mr. Lee presents case study 3 and 4, then the 2 students would present the similar speech sound disorders. Okay, so when we present or share with you the case study, we're going to do it in the following order. So first, we're going to share with you very briefly the background of the student, then followed by the student's core deficits. Then we talk about the therapy approach and strategies used to treat the student's SSD. Finally, we will compare and contrast the paired case studies. Okay, so now I start with case study 1. Okay, so this is a 6-year-old boy with unclear speech. He was referred to speech and language therapy by his DAS preschool educational therapist. Okay, so his family was puzzled by his persistent production of Akong as Atong. So he will call his grandfather. By the way, Akong means grandfather in English. Okay, so he will address his grandfather as Atong. Okay, so Atong, the Tong itself in Chinese means east, not south, east, west, that east. Okay, and he would also address Gugu, which is auntie in English, as Tutu. Okay. Yes, okay, so he started attending SLT in term 2, 2017. So he was found to have a velar fronting, which means that the way he produced k sounds more like a t, and the way he produced g sounded more like a d. Okay? And his ability to distinguish similar sounding words was not so strong. Okay. So the following treatment strategies and approaches were used to treat his SSD. So metaphor therapy to increase his awareness of the phonological structure of language, focusing on the sound properties that need to be contrasted. So for this case, we are talking about the group of voiced sounds like g versus the group of voiceless sound like k. Okay? Okay, I also use, the traditional articulation hierarchy, from isolation to word level. Okay, we also use a core vocabulary approach, which focuses on whole word production. So words selected for practice are high-frequency words used in the student's functional communication. So for this student, the words are okay, teacher Kelly, Gugu, and Akong, just to name a few. Okay, so at the same time, activities were carried out to strengthen the child's auditory discrimination ability. Okay, so this student attended 1 hour weekly individual therapy, meaning that it's one therapist to one student. And 80% of the time was spent in strengthening his auditory discrimination and treating his speech sound disorder. So this child showed positive learning attitude in therapy sessions. Okay, so this chart shows the therapy outcome for student 1. So baseline means that, at the start of the therapy, the student was unable to produce the k and g. So at the end of term 2, the student was able to produce a few k initial high-frequency words which were in his core vocabulary. However, the production was effortful and inconsistent, and he did not demonstrate any self-monitoring ability, meaning that, when he said the sound or the word wrongly, he did not know. Okay? So 10 weeks later, he had eliminated velar fronting error. He was able to produce high-frequency words with k and g, which were in his core vocabulary, and his production was not effortful. So the family was overjoyed. This is the feedback I get from the family when, they heard him calling the grandfather as Akong and the auntie as Kuku, finally, okay? Because of the good progress, he was discharged from therapy after 3 terms of intervention. Okay, so now this is case study 2. So a 7-year-old boy with unclear speech. So same as case 1, he was referred to speech and language therapy by his preschool education therapist, okay, to work on the production of sounds that he couldn't produce clearly. At the same time, his parents were also concerned about his reading and spelling difficulties. So he started SLT in the same term as student 1. So his core deficits were also similar to student 1. He struggled with the correct production of k and g. He had velar fronting, and his ability to discriminate similar sounding words was not so strong. So the treatment strategies and approaches were used to treat his speech sound disorder were first visual and tactile cues, meaning that, it's actually gentle touch on his throat, okay, to elicit k, okay, and also feel the vibration at the throat, okay, to elicit g, because we know that g is actually a voice sound, okay. And yes, the traditional hierarchy, articulation hierarchy was used from isolation to word level. So we use cycles approach, and this means that this cycle approach targets at the pattern of sounds, okay, instead of the misarticulated sounds for a short amount of time, and then cycling through other phonological processes. Okay, the contrast therapy, minimal oppositions, was used too. And this approach means that it focuses on contrasting paired sounds which differ by only one production feature. So for example, a cot versus a got. So concurrently, activities were carried out to strengthen his auditory discrimination. Okay, so this student attended 1 hour weekly group therapy with another 2 students. So 25% of the time was spent on treating his SSD and strengthening his auditory discrimination. For this child, okay, he was unwilling to participate in articulation activities which his therapy mates could do well. And constant praises were needed to get him to persevere. Okay. So this chart shows the therapy outcome for student 2. So same as case study 1, at baseline, the child could not produce k and g. So at the end of term 2, the child could produce k in isolation with tactile self-cue. So 10 weeks later, he produced words with k and g, with verbal prompts as well as tactile cues, self-cues. At the end of term 4, he could produce k and g words with occasional visual verbal prompts. And he was found to be more compliant in articulation drills. Okay, and at the same time, he was able to spell more k and g words. However, he was not discharged at the end of term 4 because he needed more practice to achieve a consistent results. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is to compare and contrast case study 1 and 2. So student 1 attended individual therapy, whereas student 2 attended group therapy. So in case study 1, 80% of the time was spent in treating SSD during each session. However, only 25% of the time was spent in treating students 2 SSD in each session. So student 1 was discharged after 3 terms of treatment. On the other hand, 1 year of intervention was not enough for student 2. He continued SLT. This time, the parents let him attend individual therapy, and it was found that he made more progress in individual therapy. Okay, so the attitude towards articulation therapy, for student 1, he displayed positive attitude in therapy sessions. However, for student 2, he showed frustration when he could not perform as well as his therapy mates. Okay, and in both cases, 1 and 2, a combination of different strategies and approaches was used to treat speech sound disorder. So now Mr. Lee will share with you case study number 3 and 4, as well as our findings in our study. Okay?
Right, for case studies 3 and 4, they both involve students who have a speech sound disorder associated with childhood apraxia of speech, right? So before I start, I would like to talk a bit about CAS, or childhood apraxia of speech. It is a motor speech disorder that's characterized by difficulties in planning, making, and sequencing oral movements to produce clear speech. So in essence, a child with CAS will have difficulties moving his jaws, his tongue, and lips to the right place at the right time to say a certain sound, right? And children with CAS are generally accepted as having inconsistent speech errors. So for example, the word cat, a child with CAS may pronounce it as hat, bat, pat, jet, gat, that, depending on the circumstance and depending on the environment or context at the point in time in which he speaks. Right? And this results in a lot of intelligibility issues, especially during spontaneous extended speech. So in other words, a child with CAS has difficulties being understood by peers as well as familiar interaction partners. Right? So what is the treatment for CAS then? Generally, it's accepted that a motor programming approach is most suitable, together with a use of multisensory cueing strategies. So a brief background of CAS before we launch into our case studies of these 2 students who have speech sound disorders associated with CAS. So for our third case study, our student is a 9-year-old boy from predominantly Chinese-speaking family. This child has been diagnosed with dyslexia and is referred to SLT for language issues and unclear speech. Upon the self-therapy, it was discovered that this child has got the following core deficits with respect to the speech. Unclear speech, as mentioned earlier, poor auditory discrimination, as well as poor language skills. The treatment approach that was selected is what is accepted in literature as being effective, which is the one I mentioned, motor programming approach and the use of multisensory cueing strategies. During the period of study, the child or the student underwent weekly 1-hour SLT sessions over 4 terms, there being 10 weeks per term, right? So here's a pictorial representation of the child's progress, right? Take a look at it. you will see that the child is making very little progress. So although the child is able to say the P and B sounds more consistently and accurately over 4 terms, which is about a year, right, that's just about what the child is able to do, right? So why is that, right? And we also know that at the end of term 4, this was the assessment by the SLT who was providing therapy for this child. The child is still no more than 50% intelligible to unfamiliar speech partners. So in other words, half of what this child says, no one understands, right? And that's quite serious, right? So this is our 3rd case study. And let's take a look at our 4th case study. Right? I'll do a compare and contrast later. So our 4th case study involves a student, this time a 9-year-old girl, with bilingual family and has been diagnosed with dyslexia as well as severe speech sound disorder. It's all very similar so far. In terms of core deficits, this girl has only unclear effortful speech. This girl is able to discriminate between sounds. In other words, she can hear the difference between a pat and a bat, a cat and a gat. She can hear it herself, okay? And she has got adequate language skills, right? A treatment approach and duration of therapy, identical as the 3rd case study. Here's a pictorial representation again of her progress, right? So across 4 terms, you will see that this girl has managed considerable progress, right? And perhaps I'll just talk to you a little bit and then we'll hear her talk herself, right? You'll notice that a lot of the sounds that she has problems with were addressed and she has success at both the sentence level and even at the extended speech level. So let's hear her speech at the beginning of therapy, before therapy started.
The first thing we do is eat.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Then we play.
Mm-hmm.
Then I tie the monkey.
You tie.
No. Try.
You try.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Monkey's bar.
Oh, the monkey bars, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like spider web.
Okay. Mm.
Then I reach to the.
You what?
I reach.
Right, so this is her at the beginning.
Reach
Mm.
to the top.
Mm-hmm.
Then I have a slide
Mm-hmm.
to go down.
Right, this is her at the beginning. You'll notice that it's really difficult to understand her, especially if you don't know where she's been to and what she has been doing, right? Yeah, so for example, she said, try the monkey bars. I thought she died, right? And that's quite weird, yeah? This is her, again, but this is after therapy over a year. And let's see whether we can hear it.
Last week, my brother, my parents, and I went to Johor Bahru. When we reached there, we bought some food. After that, we checked into Canada Hotel. My mother booked a room with a sofa, an extra bed, and a queen bed. But after we saw our room, we realized it was very small. We were disappointed. My parents and I slept on the queen bed, but we could not sleep well for the whole night because the bed was too small. The next day, we went shopping at Lian. We had a great time shopping, but we not have any great time sleeping.
Right, so that's her. You'll notice that there's still some errors in the speech, but it's more coherent now because she's less effortful, right? Her speech is less effortful now due to what she has done in the past, okay, during therapy itself. So this is what happened at the end. Her parents and teachers reported that she was much clearer in her speech. In fact, she was asked to give a speech during assembly, and she did it, so it was quite ego boosting for her. And she also mentioned that she was teased much less in school whenever she spoke. Right? So you must be wondering, here are two students with near identical diagnosis of severe speech sound disorder associated with childhood apraxia of speech, and yet the therapy outcomes are so different. So why is that? So let's look at the comparison table and see whether we can tease out any difference. Right? You will notice, for example, that in terms of therapy setting, number of terms spent in treatment, attitudes towards SSD therapy, they are all very similar or identical. What is different is the fact that student number 3 has got a comorbidity of perhaps poor auditory discrimination and very poor language skills. So what actually happened to this boy is that he's unable to monitor the production of his own speech for errors, right? And that's why it's very hard for him to hear the difference between, for example, a pat and a bat, and therefore self-correct. Right, and therefore, in his mind, he can't make the difference, or he can't tell the difference, and therefore he can't say the difference. All right. In terms of poor language skills, it could have an effect on therapy because with poor language skills, the verbal mode of giving prompts, for example, and instructions may be removed. So all you have is probably just tactile and visual prompts. Right? On the other hand, student number 4 has got adequate auditory discrimination and adequate language skills, so that perhaps played a big difference. Right, further comparison showed that all other things being the same, the main difference was that of family support. Right? Studies of children with CAS has shown that they require frequent repetitive practice. Right? And there's emerging consensus that they need therapy 3 to 5 times per week in order to make an impactful difference. Now, both students, and because both students are unable to attend more therapy sessions due to financial constraints, family support played a very huge role in influencing the outcomes. Right? Because for the third student, there was no therapy, no family support at all because both parents were working, and that the only model they could provide was a Chinese language speech model. For student number 4, the mother and caregiver actually sat in during sessions to observe how I conducted therapy, right? And they would use the same prompts that I use in home practice if the child required it. And they also ensured that the child practiced every day, twice a day. Right, so that made a huge difference. Right, so what have we found out from our 4 case studies with respect to the way we manage therapy to help children with speech sound disorders at DAS? We have found that besides looking at evidence-based therapy approaches and strategies and considering therapist-dependent factors, we have to consider this as well, student-related factors, especially motivation of the child. As Lian has mentioned in case studies 1 and 2, right, this played a key role in whether the child is able to extract maximum benefits from therapy or not. Right? In case studies 3 and 4, we also noticed that the presence of comorbidities played a key role in deciding therapy outcomes for children with SSDs. Right, we also notice and we also think that just as important, service delivery factors need to be considered as well. This includes the therapy setting. So for articulation or SSD therapy, it is best done in an individual setting rather than a group therapy setting. We also feel that family support and home practice needs to be managed. So in other words, if you're doing SSD therapy, you need to consider this aspect of therapy as well and devote time and effort to get the buy-in of the family. Otherwise, the prognosis may not be as good. Finally, we have realized that evidence-based practice, well and good. We also need to be flexible and use a combination of different treatment strategies to match the individual context of the child. For example, Shuet Lian's case study showed that the choice of keywords like kuku and akong actually made a key difference to this child. Other words don't make sense to him at all. He doesn't practice, but kuku and akong, once he said it, the reward and the reinforcement was immediate. All right, so this is what we have found so far, right? And thank you, and that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.